While pacifism is great, it can certainly come back and bite you on the bottom, and such was the case with Naboo, the human inhabitants of the plasma-cored planet of the same name. While they were by no means unarmed, the Naboo were hilariously outgunned by basically all of their opponents and, more often than not, fell short of the bar with respect to military preparedness and technology. Look, I love Padme Amidala's sleek ELG-3A blaster pistol as much as the next nerd, but in this video, we're discussing why Naboo's military, but not a military, was a steaming hot pile of bantha fodder. If you're tired of cartoonish looking games, then Raid Shadow Legends will transport you to a world of dark fantasy and realism. Use my links below to download Raid yourself to your mobile phone or PC. Raid has 16 different factions, such as orcs, dwarves, undead hordes, and many more. Personally, my favorite faction out of the 16 would have to be the Dark Elves, because they've got some pretty awesome lore behind them, and one of the many champions within the Dark Elves that I absolutely love would have to be Foley, a legendary attack Dark Elf with his affinity being magic. So his pretty cool ability, and the reason why I like him so much is because he attacks one enemy 4 times. As you can see here, the graphics in game are pretty top notch. So if you want to join me, you can find me in the game with the username Geetsly, and if you're quick enough, you can also join the clan. Go to the video description, click on the special links, and if you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver plus 1 free champion. As we said, the Naboo's pacifism is the underlying cause of their militaristic impotency, and this in itself is worth exploring before we move on to the specifics, as it helps to explain the specifics. It's also important to note that the Naboo were not always pacifists. Around 3,900 years before the Battle of Yavin, the humans who would one day become known as the Naboo fled a violent revolution on the Ecumenopolis Grismalt and settled on Naboo. In the early years of their colonization, they clashed with the Gungans on more than one occasion, and this culminated in the Gungan-Naboo War fought between 150 BBY and 121 BBY, in which the Naboo's monarch was killed, and some houses of Naboo employed mercenaries to come down from the stars and eradicate the Gungans. Obviously, not all the amphibians were eradicated, and now we're stuck with Jar Jar. The Naboo fled violence to violence, and they only began to shed themselves of it, on the surface at least, after the Gungan-Naboo War. This was when the Naboo's pacifist culture began to take root, and it's worth explaining on what pacifist culture entailed. Instead of resorting to violence, the Naboo resolved disputes with rational politics, and they were, at their heart, a friendly people whose primary pursuits in life were artistic and intellectual. This was reflected in all aspects of their culture, especially in architecture, faction, and cuisine, and all of this was immediately apparent to any being who set foot in Naboo cities, such as its flowering capital, Theed. Naboo culture produced a paradise unbefitting the region of the galaxy in which it resided, and as such, was easy prey for the likes of Higo Damask and Palpatine the Sith. But even a society built on pacifism needs some sort of muscle, and this, for the Naboo, came in the form of the Royal Naboo Security Forces, or just the RNSF, which, in keeping with the values of Naboo, was not a military organization as such, nor did it assume the title of one. Though, just like a military organization, the RNSF was comprised of branches, featuring, at times, both a naval branch and a space fighter corps, among many branches and units not too dissimilar from those of a true military. It would seem as if the Naboo were masking a true military with a paramilitary title, if the RNSF at least exhibited the competence of a true military. The RNSF was, in reality, very little more than a paramilitary organization. It was more of a leather-clad parade whose ranks were filled with part-time soldiers and volunteers. To lay it out for you, these paramilitary branches and units, as well as some specific roles within the RNSF, included the Naboo Royal Navy, the Naboo Royal Space Fighter Corps, the Palace Guard, the Queen's Honor Guard, security officers, security guards, handmaidens, grenadiers, and engineers. And even the Naboo Royal Space Fighter Corps, which was raised to confront the Trade Federation's 32 BBY blockade and subsequent invasion of Naboo, was primarily a volunteer force. The Naboo simply didn't fund military operations, and it was mostly just RNSF officers who were actually getting paid, and thus, those who volunteered could only spend so much time volunteering. They needed to earn a living too. The fact that the RNSF didn't identify as a true military was a huge part of why it was a sack of alien excrement, and it leads our discussion into two specific aspects of the RNSF which suffered because of it: leadership and material. As the RNSF was a security force and the Naboo were a largely peaceful people, the RNSF wasn't put to the test until the Sith sunk their claws into the planet with the 32 BBY blockade and invasion. It didn't venture far from Naboo, and it certainly didn't engage in peacekeeping operations like the Jedi, nor outright warfare like the clone troopers to come. The RNSF never got a chance to be tempered by war, and that left it soft, fat, and slow. Its officers were inexperienced and thus knew little of strategy and tactics. RNSF leadership, while Captain Panaka had at least the brains to realize it, was ill-adapted to face an enemy such as that in the 32 BBY blockade and invasion, which we'll get to soon. As sort of a glorified paramilitary force, the effectiveness and quantity of the RNSF's material was also lacking, especially when compared to the galaxy's true militaries. While the RNSF did have heavier land vehicles like the Heavy Champion and the Steadfast, their primary answer to AATs, especially in the 32 BBY blockade and invasion, were Flash and Gion speeders, which, while they were quick and packed a decent punch, were not designed to slug it out like their heavily armoured opponents. RNSF naval vehicles were decent, though Naboo's contemporary enemies didn't fight in the sea. Indeed, the term Navy in Star Wars was rarely used in a nautical context. On that note, the Royal Space Fighter Corps under the RNSF did fly some decent armed spacecraft, such as the N1 and its cousins, the NB-1 Royal Bomber and its variants. These were, however, especially during the 32 BBY blockade and invasion, in very short supply, and the mere existence of the Royal Space Fighter Corps was a controversial issue for the peace-loving Naboo in the first place. Really, the best ships the Naboo ever wielded were made by the fried calamari. Now, onto the 32 BBY blockade and invasion of Naboo, also known as the Battle of Naboo. Most of you should know at least a little about this particular conflict, as it was the climax of everyone's favourite Star Wars film, The Phantom Menace. Without going too much into the background of the battle, it was basically incited by the Sith, who armed the Trade Federation and used it as a hammer to crush Naboo. Unfortunately for the Sith, the Naboo, aided in no small part by the Jedi and the Gungans, deflected this hammer and restored peace to Naboo for a time. What is relevant to this video is that, while the Royal Space Fighter Corps contested the superior forces of the Trade Federation with great courage, it was 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker who almost single-handedly took out the Federation's control ship, disabling their entire droid army and enabling a Gungan diversion which allowed Amidala and an RNSF strike force to capture Viceroy Gunray and secure the win. At the start, the Naboo let the Trade Federation march into their cities, and while they did organise some resistance to the occupation and did get their act together somewhat during the battle, they would have been utterly crushed if it wasn't for the help they received. The RNSF could absolutely not have stood on its own. Having finally been hardened by war and knowing good and well that they had powerful vengeful enemies just outside their door, literally as close as Enoch, which was just one jump away, you would think Naboo would have massively reinforced the RNSF, but this was not the case. During the Clone Wars, the Naboo upgraded relatively nothing, and after the Clone Wars, during the rise of the Empire, the RNSF went toe-to-toe with the 501st Legion of Stormtroopers, getting absolutely minced, and as a result, allowing their queen at the time, Queen Apolana, to be assassinated. With the Empire in full effect, the RNSF was reduced to just the Queen's Royal Guard, literally a handful of bodyguards, and following the Battle of Yavin, during the Galactic Civil War, the remnants of the RNSF were scarcely able to hold back the criminals who had taken root in Naboo during the occupation of the Empire, and once again needed outside help. The Naboo and the RNSF failed to adapt to a galaxy at war. They really only improved their on-planet defenses when they really should have raised a proper military, a space force. I mean, they did have all the plasma, right? The Naboo perhaps got a little too confident following their victory in the 32 BBY Battle of Naboo, but that's no excuse. The Clone Wars was as good a time as any for the Naboo to put down their paintbrushes, but they didn't. And the rise of the Empire came way too fast for the Naboo to do anything about it. They failed due to only pure idealistic arrogance, and this is why Naboo's military, but not a military, is always a steaming pile of hot bantha fodder. But what do you think? Were we too hard on Naboo and the RNSF? Should Jar Jar have been blasted into smoldering shreds in the Battle of Naboo? Let us know in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, please do check out those juicy links in the description below to join us on our main Discord server where you can chat with other Star Wars fans, our Geetsly's Gaming Network on Gary's Mod and Roblox, and the Patreon if you want to help support the channel. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.